This, my friends, is the Bear 650, a beautiful looking new bike from Royal Enfield, all offered at one of their typically tempting price points too. But does it ride as good as it looks, and is it now the retro scrambler to buy in 2025? Well, Fowlers here in Bristol have been kind enough to lend me their demo for the day, and so let's take it for a spin to find out. Now, one thing that always has been and always will be very pleasant about these Enfield 650s is the sort of feel that you get from the engine, especially in this retro category where an air-cooled parallel twin gives it the appropriate character and soul. It certainly won't be the most powerful of the bunch at about 47 horsepower peak. And it's not necessarily a featherweight bike, so, you know, acceleration's going to be limited, especially when the speed gets up. But one could argue slightly old school performance figures suit these slightly old school looks. Now, despite not being super powerful, there's still plenty to like about this engine. There's enough torque there to feel satisfying, there's a nice light action at the clutch. I like the chunky levers too, and they're adjustable, which is a nice inclusion at this sort of price. The gearbox is reassuring and precise with no real ambiguity, and the sound at the exhaust isn't too bad either. Other 650 Enfields get twin silencers, so one either side, like the Interceptor or the Continental GT or the Shotgun or Super Meteor, whereas this gets a 2-into-1 with one silencer on the right, I guess to give it a bit more of the look, especially with that heat shield, but also they say to save a little bit of weight. And yeah, it does look quite good. It suits the rest of the look of the bike. I guess the only trade-off is you don't get the stereo sound of one of the other 650 Enfields, and it's not especially loud or bassy, but fundamentally a parallel twin with a 270 crank that's air-cooled is always going to have a fairly nice sound to it, and so I'd definitely chalk that up as a positive. Straight away as well, I'm very much liking this slightly more commanding riding position that comes as a result of a bit more length in the suspension in order to make it ever so slightly more off-road capable. The seat height's up at 830mm as opposed to 804 on the Interceptor, and so yeah, you just feel a bit more sat up, and especially in traffic like this or when I was back there, you do get quite an easy view over the cars. The bars, as you'd expect for a scrambler, are a little bit wider and more sat up perhaps than the Interceptor, and so that kind of helps as well. It keeps you nice and upright. And then you do get some rather chunky, more off-road biased foot pegs that do feel nice and comfy. So I'm about 5'9" or 175 centimeters, and it feels good to me. I can just about get both feet down quite easily as well. But for anyone who's above that height, who's always fancied a 650 Enfield but maybe thought they looked a little small, then this is definitely going to be your best choice of the bunch, with a seat height that's significantly higher than the Interceptor. And then of course the other two, the Super Meteor and the Shotgun, are more like cruiser inspired, so they're even lower. Now, another potential advantage, let's say, of this bike, because it kind of depends where you stand on tech, is in the cockpit with the TFT dash as opposed to the analog clocks that you'll find on the rest of the Enfield 650 lineup. Now, it is still a fairly simple bike. There's no traction control, no riding modes. You can switch off ABS at the rear with the button on the switchgear there, and so don't expect loads of menus and customization and things like that. But what it does give you is a few different layouts, automatic switching between a light and dark theme depending on the conditions, and also, perhaps most importantly, some connectivity features like navigation using the Royal Enfield app, and also using your phone for stuff like calls and media. I guess
guess they have tried to please both camps in that they've styled it in a sort of semi-retro way. It's in a round housing, it's got the right fonts and layouts, but still with those more modern day capabilities within. And so yeah, I guess they're hoping that they've struck the right balance with this one.
Now, I should add that if you're wanting to take advantage of the connectivity capabilities of this dash, especially with regards to calls and media, then you'll need a comms headset to connect to over Bluetooth, and we'd recommend what we think are the best in the business, and that's Cardo. We use their flagship PackTalk Edge and PackTalk Pro, both of which have excellent audio quality, and their brilliant dynamic mesh communication system, which allows you to pair up to 15 riders in a group with a mile between each, and it's also self-healing, which means you don't have to manually repair if someone drops off the group and then catches back up. On top of that, the PackTalk Pro gets their brilliant new crash detection feature, which can alert an emergency contact if it detects an accident, which I think is a valuable bit of extra reassurance every time you're out on the bike. So do check out the link down in the description below to find out more, and you'll also find down there a discount code specifically for our viewers. So a massive thanks to Cardo for their support and for sponsoring this video and making content like this possible.
I think I'd also say as well, given that you're paying just 300 or 400 quid more than an Interceptor for this bike, you know, some of the upgrades to the chassis look pretty good on paper anyway. The regular right way up fork of the Interceptor makes way for a Showa upside down fork, and they've also given the fork and shock a little bit more travel to make this bike a touch more versatile, and of course that gives it more ground clearance as well. Then you've got a 19-incher up front instead of the 18 of the Interceptor, which should help it to roll a little better on gravel and light trails, and they're shod with what you'd say are probably mainly road tyres, but with a little bit of off-road ability in these MRF, well, they look like Pirelli Scorpion Trails, but yeah, they're MRF's version. Then with a slightly longer swing arm for a touch more stability, a beefed up headstock so it can take more impacts off-road, and a little bit of an upward flick to the subframe as well, which is more for styling than anything, I guess. You know, you do have a bike that's built to be a bit more capable off-road, but I'm not necessarily convinced that that's a good thing.
You see, thing is with a bike like this is that it's not so off-road focused that I'd be gagging to take it, you know, riding on trails and stuff. It's still fairly weighty. I wouldn't say it's got the best standing position because the bars are a little bit too low. It has more travel and ground clearance than an Interceptor, but still not a huge amount. And so I wouldn't say it's particularly appealing to do that kind of riding with something like this. And I'm sure if you did want to do more serious off-road riding, then Royal Enfield would happily sell you a Himalayan 450, which is way more qualified for the job and designed for a mix of on and off. Now, I wouldn't necessarily say the Bear is a bad handling bike on the road, but it's still a little less snappy, let's say, than either an Interceptor or a Continental GT. The longer swing arm and the bigger front wheel naturally mean it's not as quick to turn, and while the fork feels decent, well, the shocks are extra firm on this bike, and so it's really quite harsh over lumps and bumps in the road. Then, the tyres, well, they feel alright, but with a fairly blocky tread pattern like that, well, they're never going to feel as smooth or sticky as proper road tyres. It's not just Royal Enfield as well. I had the exact same conclusion when I rode the Triumph Speed 400 last year and the Scrambler 400X. The Scrambler is not a bike that you'd look at and say it's, you know, an aggressive rally bike, and yet on the road it's just not as exciting to ride as the Speed 400. Now, that doesn't all mean that you shouldn't buy a Bear 650, because I think there's a lot to be said for it. It looks fantastic, the price is very good as well, and it is pleasant enough out on the road. But yeah, the key reasons to buy it over an Interceptor are more so the more spacious ergonomics, perhaps the TFT dash if you like that sort of thing, and that little bit of versatility for gravel roads and things like that. But for a lot of people, if you're honest with yourself that you'll be pretty much entirely riding on the road, then I'd say the Interceptor is probably the better purchase.
The image of a Scrambler, though, is a large part of its appeal, and I can totally understand why you might overlook some of the compromises on the road to get a bike that you really like the look of. In that case, you're probably not even considering an Interceptor or Continental GT, and a more pressing concern would be whether to go for the bare 650 or pay the extra for the 900 Scrambler from Triumph.
Now this one is sold, but you're looking at about $3,000 more for one of these, so they start in the high 9,000s as opposed to the 6,749 of the Enfield. But I will say you're getting a slightly higher level of finish, as you might expect, especially with this Icon edition with the lovely paintwork on the tank there, although you do pay a little bit more still further for that. And of course with this engine being liquid cooled as opposed to air cooled and 900cc as opposed to 650, you've just got that bit more power, so it's more like 65 PS as opposed to the 47. So if you're wanting to do, you know, motorway work and stuff like that, then this bike is going to feel more capable and more relaxed, let's say, at 60 and 70. It's also much lower in the seat. I think this is 790, so really low and accessible. So one to look at if you want a retro Scrambler but you're not particularly tall. And then also, while it is an analog clock in the cockpit here, you do actually get traction control and a couple of riding modes. So in some ways the tech is simpler, in some ways, you know, it's a little more modern. Another plus for this bike as well is that the shocks are pretty cushy, so if you're looking for a comfy bike, this will do a better job. But I think for a lot of people it's going to depend on what your budget is, and of course if you pay more you're going to get more performance, a few more techie features and better finish.
If, however, 6 or 7 grand is your absolute maximum, then it has to be said the bare 650 is a heck of a lot of bike for the money. The looks are fantastic, the engine feels soulful, and the dash is a nice bonus if you like that sort of thing. All round, it's probably the most authentic feeling retro Scrambler you can currently buy, and while the handling might not be razor sharp, and the shocks might need upgrading, well, assuming you're alright with that, then it's a great bike for the money that I'd at very least recommend a demo on.
As always, I'd love to know what you think of the bike, so do let me know down in the comments below. And if you want to see our pick of some of the other best retro Scramblers on the market, then I'll put our list on the screen now so you can give it a click and give it a watch in case you haven't already. Do hit subscribe for more of the latest motorcycle reviews like this right here on MOTOBOB. A massive thanks for watching today, and we'll see you in the next video.